Hello, everyone. This is Pastor John from Third Presbyterian Church. We're located right next to Enos Park in the northern part of the city of Springfield, Illinois. You're invited to join us now for week 5 of the series Amazing Wisdom, Amazing Women. Today we're going to look at Tamar. Tamar has an interesting story, and it's sort of a story that would be difficult to explain to kids in a Sunday school class. So prepare yourself for this to be a little bit of an interesting story. We find Tamar, though, is a fascinating woman. She makes bold choices, and she receives God's redemptive power, and so certainly her story is one that needs to be shared. To introduce Tamar into our story, we need to take a look at yet one more chart showing all of the children that are part of the 12 sons of Jacob. We're going to focus on 3 of those sons for our discussion of Tamar. First of all, look at Joseph. Joseph, remember, was the firstborn son of Rachel. Rachel was the second wife of Jacob, but really the wife that he loved. Remember that he was forced to marry Leah, or tricked into marrying Leah at first, and then he had to work an additional 14 years to get the hand of Rachel. But it was Rachel that he really loved. And in fact, his firstborn son from Rachel, Joseph, was made very clear in the scriptures to be the favorite of Jacob's. Well, you can imagine if Joseph is thought to be the favorite of dad, then the other 11 sons might be just a tad bit jealous about that. And in fact, one of those sons that was extremely jealous was a son named Judah. Judah, in fact, plots to actually have Joseph killed. But Reuben intervenes and suggests that instead of killing Joseph, they send him off with a traveling group of gypsies and send him into another land where he will work as a servant. And that way they can get rid of him and they could tell his father that he was accidentally killed, but they would actually spare his life. Shortly after that incident with Joseph, and Joseph is sold into slavery, so to speak, Judah leaves his family home and he goes back to the land of Canaan. When he arrives in the land of Canaan, he meets a Canaanite woman, marries her, and they have a son named Now, takes on a wife named Tamar. And so that's how we get Tamar into the story. So she's the wife of the son of Judah, which of course would make her Judah's daughter-in-law. All right, let's take a look at how this story develops. As we now look into more detail in the story of Tamar, first of all, we read in the scripture that her husband, the son of Judah, first son of Judah, dies. When he dies, that leaves her a widow, and because he dies without having any male offspring, she immediately falls under the Levitic marriage code. Livera is the Latin word for brothers, for husband's brother or brother-in-law. And so under that code, if a man dies not having any male children, offspring, then his widow is automatically married to his next brother, and it's the brother's responsibility to then impregnate his widow. Those children are considered his children, the deceased children, even though they were brought about by the brother. And they receive their share of the inheritance along with anyone else. So when dies, the next brother is a brother named Onan. Onan then becomes her husband. Now, Onan is not happy about this situation. Scholars have suggested that perhaps one of the things was that he looked very closely at the inheritance that was available to his offspring, and if he were to have offspring with Tamar, then he would have to share that inheritance with them. And so he's not happy about this situation at all. He's not happy with the thought of having offspring from Tamar. So even though he performs a sexual act with her, as the custom would dictate and as his father told him to do, he practices an ancient birth control that the Bible talks about. And so as a result of that, practicing that birth control, Tamar never gets pregnant. In fact, the scriptures talk about this birth control method as spilling his seeds on the ground. So I think all of us can understand what he did in order to keep Tamar from getting pregnant. Well, this goes on for a long time, and all of a sudden there is this concern now that Tamar is not able to get pregnant. Let's read now from Genesis 38:11 through 12 as to what happens next in the story. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up." For he thought, he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's household. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hirah, the Adullamite, went with him. So Judah is certainly not happy that Tamar is not able to have any children. But of course, she's not able to have any children because Onan refuses to complete the sex act with her to allow her to get pregnant. But that isn't the way Judah sees it. Judah sees that she must be an evil person because she will not allow his son Onan to become pregnant. So he has a younger son. We don't know how much younger this son is, but he's not having her marry this younger son, Shelah. In fact, he sends her away and tells her, well, maybe when my son gets old enough, we'll bring you back so you can marry him. But according to the text, he really doesn't have any intent or desire in having that happen. Now, after Tamar goes away, then Judah's wife passes away, which makes him a widower. And so Judah refuses to have her marry his third son, Shelah. So Tamar goes back to her family. She knows that she's been rejected by Judah and his people. And perhaps there's a little indication in the text that there was a whisper campaign about Tamar and what an evil, wicked person she was, and how dare she not have children with her brothers, with her husband's brother, which was the faithful and honorable thing to do in those particular times. Keeping in mind that Onan, the brother, is really the evil one here. Now, Tamar does go back to be with her family, but she never forgot how she was wronged by her father-in-law, Judah. So she hatches a plan. Let's read from the text what that plan is. From Genesis 39:13 through 19 in the NIV, when Tamar was told, your father-in-law, that would be Judah, is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that, though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife, which of course was Judah's plan all along. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked, which was a fair question if she truly was a prostitute. And so Judah responds with, "I'll send you a young goat from my flock." "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" And then he says, "What pledge shall I give you?" "Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand," she answered. So he gave to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. And she left. She took the veil and put on her widow's clothes again. She took off the veil and put on her widow's clothes again. So a little bit of trickery is going on here. But the interesting thing is that she asked for something to hold on to make him honor his commitment to send her a young goat as payment for her services. Now, it mentions that Judah gave her his seal, which would probably most likely be a ring that he had, which would have had a signet embedded in it that he would use as his particular seal. The cord that's talked about was probably an article of clothing, such as a scarf or a shawl. The staff would have been something Judah used when he was herding sheep. Most shepherds would design a pattern on their staff to represent who they were, so the staff would not get confused or used by someone else. There's an important thing here. Collectively, these items really had no monetary value, but they did identify very specifically who Judah was. Now remember in the story that Judah sleeps with Tamar and she becomes pregnant. Let's continue. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Abdullamite, in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her. He asked the men who lived there, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim?" "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here," they said. So he went back to Judah and said, "I didn't find her. Besides, the men who live there said there hasn't been any shrine prostitute here." Then Judah said, "Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughing stock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you couldn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant." So again, as we look at this story, he decides that he is going to keep his promise and send this goat to her. So he sends his friend with the goat, but the friend can't find Tamar anywhere. And he's actually looking for a prostitute. But remember, Tamar, after her little arrangement with Judah, puts her widow's clothes back on. And so the people of her area only know her as a widow. They don't know her as a prostitute. And when confronted, they mention that there's been no shrine prostitute. Shrine prostitutes were those women who would stand outside the temple and would offer their services as someone was walking along the road. Now, about 3 months pass, so that Tamar is really showing now that she's pregnant. And because she's not married, and because she doesn't have a husband or her husband's brother, then the assumption is she must have become pregnant because she sold herself out. She became a prostitute. Well, obviously, this inflames Judah, who believes now his daughter-in-law is guilty of prostitution. So he wants her to come and face what may lay for her based upon her choices. Let's continue the story. Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said. And she added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Well, of course, Judah knows who they are. So he immediately knows that she's pregnant because of his choice to sleep with a prostitute. It goes on to say, Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her my son Shelah," and he did not sleep with her again. So in this particular passage, Judah is hit with the reality that he has not only slept with a prostitute, or who he thought was a prostitute, but he slept with his daughter-in-law, which was really considered taboo in those particular times. And so he declares that she's really the one that's righteous. She didn't do anything wrong. She basically suffered under his decisions. And so he is, in a way, being repentant there to proclaim she didn't do anything. I'm the one who did everything. And because of that, I will certainly not sleep with her again. Now, according to the text, Tamar has twins from Judah. She names the first one Perez and the second one Zerah. So here we go with another set of twins in the biblical narrative. Now, there's an important resolution to this whole story and an importance as to why this story is included in the Old Testament text. Matthew has a genealogy for Jesus, pointing out who he is as the Messiah, because he is, after all, the son of David, who was, of course, the son of Abraham. So Matthew goes on to bring this very detailed lineage of who the ancestors were up to David, and then who the ancestors were from David up to Jesus. And of course, there's some familiar names there. Abraham was, of course, the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and all the 11 other brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. So even though this offspring was ill-gotten and was done in a taboo sort of way, it's still Judah's offspring. And so Matthew notes that Perez is part of this lineage of Abraham through Judah. So Perez is the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram Abinadab, Abinadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Bohab the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse, of course, is the father of King David. So Matthew points out that the lineage from Abraham through David does go through Judah and through Tamar. Now, what's important is that Matthew only lists 4 women in all of this genealogy. And he lists Tamar as the first woman. He also lists Rahab, and he also lists Ruth. I think what the biblical text was trying to point out is that even though Tamar plotted a rather evil plan against Judah, she did that because she was wronged by Judah in the first place, and the result of that was an offspring who actually then becomes the lineage of Jesus. And so Tamar is resolved in that story to have an important part in the history and development of the Savior of the world. So it's almost as if even though she does something that's wrong, she gets a reprieve from that. There's forgiveness, and she gets reestablished as an important part in the lineage of Jesus. Well, as we have done with the other ones, let's take a look at what we call the wisdom of these ladies, and this is the wisdom of Tamar. She was a complete outsider to the Abrahamic tradition, and she appears, according to the text, to be a dutiful wife who unfortunately has her husband die. Passes away, and then she's simply following tradition to be married to his brother, Onan. Well, her second husband is evil, and he doesn't want to have any children from her, so what does he do? He throws her under the bus. And because he throws her under the bus, she's treated poorly by her father-in-law, and then she's either expelled or leaves in disgrace to return back to her family. So Tamar's life is going along perfectly fine until suddenly there's an upheaval because her husband dies and her brother-in-law refuses to really follow the proper tradition. And then she gets blamed for not being the obedient and dutiful wife that she should have been under the law. Well, she doesn't forget this unjust treatment at the hands of Judah, so she hatches a pretty good plan to catch him, and eventually she forces him to admit he was wrong. The text then goes on in her wisdom that God blesses her with twins, one of which continues the lineage to David and ultimately to Jesus. And we believe that Matthew is following a Jewish tradition that now places her in a position of honor by listing her by name as only one of 4 women in the lineage narrative of Jesus. Tamar is a woman who has been wronged, and she's done nothing wrong, but she's been wronged, and she takes a moment to leave, but then she doesn't forget, and she eventually comes back and gets even. Now, those kinds of stories are not necessarily looked on in favorable light, and yet she then is included in the lineage of Jesus. So maybe there is an important message in that story that you can't treat anyone with disrespect. You can't throw anyone under the bus. And when you plot and do evil, be careful, because that evil has a tendency to come back and plot itself against you. Well, that's our story of Tamar. Now we're going to look at Tamar in relationship to someone else in the lineage of Jesus. And that person is named Ruth. So next week we will look at the story of Ruth from the Old Testament as we continue looking at these pairs of women. So we will compare a little bit of Tamar and Ruth, because they're very closely related in that lineage that brings them to David, who then becomes the lineage and father seed of Jesus. Thank you so much for listening to this Bible study this week. Have a blessed week, and we will see you next time for a continuation of our Bible study as we look at Ruth.